We have 44 different sponsors this year, and I need to recognize them because this event takes a lot of planning, a lot of logistical details to work out, and we couldn't have done it without the sponsors. Our presenting sponsor, Beacon at Salisbury University, and you'll hear from Dr. Memo Diriker in just a few minutes on our first panel. Our media sponsor, WBOC. We have CEO level sponsors, also our top sponsors. Orsted, you'll hear a presentation on an update on offshore wind today. The Greater Ocean City, Maryland Chamber of Commerce, thank you. Global Play Network, and USTASC Operations. They are our CEO level sponsors. Chairman level sponsors, our good friends at Tidal Health, Perdue Farms, Pohanka of Salisbury, Avery Hall Insurance, Cheney Enterprises, Effective TV, a Comcast company, The Voice Network, and SBTS Group, Technology Made Simple. Our board level sponsors, Allen and Sharif, Associated Builders and Contractors, Chesapeake Shores, Baxter's Enterprises Incorporated, BBSI, PKS and Company, Veronica James, Realtor for EAR Martin, Gillis Gilkerson, Salisbury Wycomico Economic Development, State Farm Greg Riddell Insurance, SBDC in Maryland, Shore Transit, Delmarva Power, Fairchild Properties, Worcester County Economic Development, Tri-County Council, Delmarva Veteran Builders, Mount Air Farms, SVN Miller Commercial Real Estate, Coastal Association of Realtors, Chesapeake Utilities, Patriot Facilities Infrastructure Solutions, and our supporter level sponsors, Bancroft Construction, Minuteman Press, the Bank of Delmarva, Davis, Bowen and Friedel Incorporated, Providence State Bank, Davis Strategic, Hebron Savings Bank, W.R. McCain and Associates, and NAI Coastal. How about a round of applause for all these great sponsors? So to bring us a warm welcome from beautiful Ocean City and the Convention Center, I want to bring up the executive director of this great facility, Larry Nocolino. Larry.
Thank you so much, Bill. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Roland E. Powell Convention Center, and more importantly, thank you for your continued support, and thank you for your business, and I hope to see a lot more of you. I see a whole lot of familiar faces out there, and as less than yesterday. So welcome back. I also want to apologize for the dust. We're in the middle of a $37 million project right now with completion to be on or about January 1 of 22. And we're adding an additional 30,000 square feet of exhibit space, 15,000 square feet of pre-function space, and a couple bathrooms up here. You saw the pipe and drape, and so we're really looking forward to its completion and getting ready to do phase 4, I guess. This is phase 3 we're in now, but thank you so much again. Welcome, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Larry. Restrooms out the door, down the hall. The escalator that most of you came up, they'll be across from that. There will be a break at 10:15, but again, feel free to use the restrooms as you will. If you have arrived a little bit late, let one of the folks here at Center Plate know, and they'll bring you a breakfast plate. We will have kind of a working lunch today. We'll have a presentation at 12:15 from Matt Drew at Orsted, and then around 12:25, your lunches will be served to your seats by the staff here at the Convention Center. And then we have our legislators with us at 12:45 to answer some tough questions about the General Assembly session that just ended. So a lot of good stuff going on today, and we're glad you're with us. Our first panel this morning, this is something that is probably more important than ever. The economy seems to be on everybody's minds, either first or second, along with the pandemic. But we're really honored to have Dr. Memo Diriker, Director of Beacon at Salisbury University, and Dr. Dustin Chambers, Professor of Economics, Franklin P. Perdue School of Business. They're going to bring us up to date on what the national economy is forecast, the local economy and its impacts based on the national economy, and then looking at our region, because we are a region here, and this event covers Delaware, Virginia, and Maryland. So without further ado, I welcome our first panelist up to the stage.
Good morning, everybody. How's everybody? Coffee kicking in? Yeah. Wonderful. I cannot tell you how great it is to see people in person, even though we can't shake hands, at least the bumps. It's been a while. In fact, when I first planned to make this presentation, I was going to say, what are your plans for the holidays? But that event had to be canceled. But in preparation for our traditional December forecast, we did something that we do every year. We go to a panel of respondents that we work with in our 9 counties, and this time we added, of course, Sussex County and Northampton and Accomack counties. And we went to these opinion leaders, key informants, and we asked them, we do this every year, as I said, we said, how were the past 12 months? And then what do you think the next 12 months are going to be like? So what I'm going to share with you, by the way, the summary of that is at the front where you checked in. If you want a copy, just on your way out, just grab one. When we asked them in November 2020 how the previous 12 months had been, in terms of the overall economic activity, they said slower. We asked them, how do you think it's going to be in the next 12 months? Again, remember, this is November 2020. They said, we expect there to be moderate growth. This was the picture late November 2020. Dustin is going to share with you what has happened since and what's going on. But I just wanted to set the stage with what we heard from them in November. And the theme of slower growth, down, up, you're going to see that in most of these. We asked them how was hiring during the past 12 months. They said slow. What do you think it's going to be in 2021? They said it's going to be moderately better. How about capital expenditures? Slow. 2021, moderately better. Manufacturing, this one didn't improve that much. It went from slow to neutral. Overall prices, they said it was neutral, but they were beginning to see some price increases in a variety of ways. So they predicted 2021 to be a year of slow but increasing prices. Slowly increasing prices. They predicted the very same thing about wages. They said that they are competing in some cases with people who are receiving stimulus aid and are reluctant to return to work, both for COVID reasons as well as financial reasons. So hiring, they thought was going to be, wages they thought was going to have to go up a little bit to attract those people who were not willing to come back. We also asked them about home prices. At the beginning, they said in 2020 there was a slow increase, but they saw that it was going to grow quite a bit more as they went into 2021. So they predicted it as a very solid, strong growth. On lending, they went from slightly lower in 2020 to moderate growth in 2021. And credit quality, they saw the same thing, from slower to slow increases, slow improvements. Existing home sales went from slow increase to solid growth. Commercial real estate sales and leasing from slow to neutral. That one didn't improve as much, and you're going to hear a lot more about that with different panelists today. Retail went from slower to some slow increase. On the other hand, e-commerce went from solid growth to even more growth. There are some indications that some of that e-commerce growth is going to stay, but a little bit of it is going to taper back into brick and mortar retail, and we'll talk about that later as well. Tourism was slow in their 2020 observations, but they were hopeful that there would be moderate growth in 2021 as vaccinations improved. And this is what we're seeing nationally. Let's hope that on our corner of the world this will be the case. We are very hopeful here because we are within driving distance of a very large population, and there's pent-up demand for some vacationing. And then the final question we always ask them is that, confidence in the economy. They said in 2020 it was pretty low, and in 2021, they expected it to be very high. Hope was the word that was used the most commonly, and enthusiasm was the second most common word. This was the picture in November 2020. We postponed the event. Here we are, April 28th. So let's see what Dustin has to say with regards to what has happened since November 2020 and what's going on in our economy. Dustin? Oh, Bill, how do we do the slides? Right in front of me, that would help.
Let's see.
There we go.
Okay, great. Thanks, Memo, for that warm introduction. I feel a bit like the weatherman insofar as I'm only the messenger here. Hopefully, I'm going to deliver good news for everyone. In fact, I think that the medium-term outlook actually is pretty good nationally, but there are some storm clouds on the horizon and some things to be concerned about long-term economically. So looking at recent growth projections, you can see that globally, obviously there was a sharp contraction in output in 2020. If you look at the overall global economy, it fell by about 3.3% last year. In advanced countries, we saw an even sharper contraction of 4.7%. compared to a more moderate contraction in developing markets and developing economies of 2.2%, in large part reflection on the aggressiveness with which some world leaders locked down their economies. But in every case, we're looking at pretty sharp rebound to growth in 2021. We're coming off a low base, and it's relatively easy to bring production back online. As you recall, workers who were sidelined in the prior year. So that is a typical kind of recovery path that you would expect. And then, of course, growth is going to taper off once the low-hanging fruit is grabbed. And then you're back to more normal rates of growth moving forward into 2022. If you look at the projections by region, again, we're seeing a definite V-shaped recovery across the board, with basically most of the developed world coming back pretty sharply in 2021. A little bit softer growth in Europe and some other developed countries that have lagged behind because of either slow vaccinations or more aggressive lockdowns. But overall, a pretty encouraging picture looking forward over the next 2 years. If you look at U.S. unemployment numbers, you can see the large elephant in the room. We had gradually improving labor markets in the U.S. going back to the recovery period after the last housing crash, continuing through the last 2 administrations. But obviously with the onset of COVID, huge and sudden increase in the unemployment rate. So the U.S. and indeed the world really hasn't seen anything like that in modern times, given just the nature of an exogenous shock like this. But the good news is that we're also seeing a very sharp improvement and rebound in the labor market, although unemployment does remain elevated. I've heard anecdotally talking to various small business owners, one real major challenge is that that employers are willing to pay quite a bit more to try to attract workers to come in, but they're really finding it very difficult to attract workers, even though they're willing to pay higher wage rates. There was a McDonald's franchisee owner, I think in Missouri, willing to pay $50 bonuses for people just to come in for an interview, and was struggling to attract folks to come in. So this is reflecting what Memo was talking about, people voluntarily withdrawing from the labor force. So we're going to need to see an uptick in labor force participation numbers if we want to see the rebound continue. And this is reflected in this slide here. You can see the sharp drop-off in the proportion of the adult population that's actually in the labor force. So a lot of folks have exited. Some people have come back, but there remains a pretty substantial gap. We saw this during the housing crash as well, as policymakers extended unemployment benefits, which at the outset seemed like a compassionate thing to do. But as the economy has recovered, it's ill-advised to continue with really aggressive unemployment benefits going forward, as it creates a disincentive to not re-enter the labor force, and we're indeed seeing that in the data. In terms of overall recovery by industry, we're also seeing pretty sharp rebounds across the board. Within the US, manufacturing has lagged behind, as has high contact service sector industries like restaurants, for example. But we are seeing steady improvement across the board. In this graph, we're looking at various forms of small businesses and their overall recovery in the United States due to COVID-19. And you can see that amongst those small businesses that were high contact, not surprisingly, you saw the sharpest contraction. So hospitality, restaurant industry was hit very, very hard. Other industries have pretty rapidly rebounded. As Memo mentioned, online retail, for example, has come back very strong. We're seeing a lot of strength in home improvement sector, people reinvesting in their homes, real estate strong. But other sectors are still lagging behind. And if we look at bankruptcies or looking at survey data in terms of long-term projections among small business owners, we do see a disproportionate number of small businesses in these high-contact industries saying that they're either going to file for bankruptcy or that they have a very pessimistic outlook in terms of the rebound prospects moving forward. Now, if you look at U.S. personal income and consumption, you see a pretty sharp contrast here. The red line, my eyes kind of failed me. I thought I'd have a screen here to read this. I believe the red line is the, which one is that, Memo?
I can't see.
I can't see it from here. Red one's the expenditures. Yeah. What you're seeing there is that with the dual stimulus payments, you see the little two humps that occurred after the crash were basically the stimulus payments hitting the household sector. So you saw a pretty sharp increase in income, but you didn't see a concomitant increase in consumption. There was a bit of a lag, especially with the first stimulus payment. So the difference between income and consumption is, of course, savings. And we've seen a huge increase in the personal savings rate. I had updated these slides. I think this is the old version of the slides. So, yeah, we do have that. Okay, so the personal savings rate hit like 35% at the outset of this particular recession. Going back to the beginning of record keeping in the US, there'd been nothing even close to that level of savings in the United States. So what that suggests is that a lot of the stimulus payments are basically going to either deleverage and pay down debt, or they're being dumped into purchasing assets. You see the bit of a bubble in the stock market, the real estate market's on fire right now. A lot of that money is basically being rechanneled into the purchase of assets, which doesn't have a huge stimulating effect, at least initially with the economy. With homes, you get a knock-on effects with people improving properties, but with like equity investments, you're not going to see a big bump in growth as a result of an appreciation in stock prices. At the same time, federal debt has increased. You know, where does the stimulus money come from? Well, the government has to borrow it in order to pay for the stimulus funding. So overall levels of debt way north of 100%. Macroeconomists are pretty clear empirically if you look at countries over time. When you get above 90%, there is a cooling effect on growth rates moving forward. So this is a very concerning development. The level of US debt really isn't sustainable if we continue on this path. The US does need to bring those debt levels down. Money supply, this is a scary graph. If you look at money in circulation in the United States, 80 cents out of every dollar was minted in the last year. So that's phenomenal. It's almost a 5x increase in the money supply in about 1 year's time. So how does this connect with the overall picture? Well, when you have a government that's borrowing like crazy in the bond market to pay stimulus checks, there's no money coming in terms of the Treasury collecting tax revenues. They're borrowing that money. The Federal Reserve is essentially purchasing those bonds and printing money to pay for them. So the U.S. is indirectly monetizing its debt at this point. We haven't seen a lot of inflation in the United States yet, but we are seeing a lot of asset price inflation. So homes, stocks, cryptocurrencies, things like that are shooting up in price. Not so much goods and services yet, but if you increase the money supply by those kinds of magnitudes, it's only a matter of time before you start to see more price pressure at the retail level. And so the graph here reflects that we're back to trend level inflation rates. In fact, inflation rates are creeping up to higher and higher levels. The trajectory looks like it's much higher moving forward. U.S. interest rates, however, have remained low, and this is in large part a reflection of Federal Reserve policy to keep both sovereign debt rates and mortgage rates down. But we have seen a spike in risk premiums to corporate debt. That's come down since the initial onset of COVID-19, but there is an elevated risk premium that corporate bond payers are paying to borrow money in the bond market. Now, those low mortgage rates that you saw on the previous slide, of course, translate into increased housing demand, and this is both Wicomico and Worcester County going back a number of years, and you can see the sharp run-up. The initial hump was the first housing bubble around 06 to 08, and you can see that there has been a recovery since that time, and the market seems to be on fire. There's no end in sight. Unemployment numbers on the shore. Unfortunately, the federal government doesn't publish these with high frequency, so we have a lack of data, more recent data in this area. But we do have better data at the state level. That's the green line. And as you would anticipate with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a sharp increase in the state of Maryland's unemployment rate, and it has come down, kind of mirroring what's happening nationally. So we can only assume that we have a similar picture at the county level here, but we don't yet have data to verify that yet. In terms of weekly jobless claims, this is the highest frequency data released by the federal government with respect to the labor force and labor markets. And you can see that jobless claim numbers have come down pretty significantly since the start of the pandemic, but they do remain elevated compared to what they looked like pre-epidemic, so like January, February of 2020. With respect to Ocean City and the tourism trade on the shore, there are some rays of hope here. This is a plot of U.S. travel statistics. The red line represents passenger miles, and not surprisingly, the airline industry collapsed with the onset of COVID-19, but you are starting to see a significant rebound, but we've got a long ways to go until we see the kind of traffic volumes that we had in late 2019 and early 2020. For the shore, what is good is that we're seeing lots of travel with respect to vehicle traffic. So those numbers have generally recovered to their pre-COVID-19 levels. Some of that is freight traffic as well. The federal government doesn't break that number down between like passenger miles versus freight miles, but the overall aggregate's looking pretty good. So for an area like Ocean City, where most folks tend to day trip in or drive into the area as opposed to flying, that makes this area particularly attractive. If you can't fly to go off on vacation, you're more likely to drive, and an area like Ocean City in the mid-Atlantic area near so many population centers would be an attractive alternative to, say, flying to Europe or flying across the United States. And then finally, looking at something that really hits close to home, retail chicken prices. If you look at the ag sector on Delmarva, most of it is grain production for chickens. So the chicken price data is kind of a broad barometer of agricultural industry health in the region, and we have seen an uptick in prices, both with respect to chicken breasts on the top and then whole chickens on the bottom. And with inflation, you'll probably see a lot higher increases in chicken prices going forward, but it might not translate into real profits for producers. So I think that's it, Memo.
Okay. So Dustin brought us to speed, and let's talk a little bit about what the future holds for our region, Southern Delmarva region. When we look at our region, we see different economic clusters, of course, agriculture being one. There is also tourism industry, there's aerospace with NASA Wallops, and there are all kinds of other clusters, construction, retail, real estate, business services. But there are also some obstacles in our way that we need to be aware of. Of course, one, Dustin mentioned, the supply chain is still strained quite a bit. Companies are having a difficult time getting the materials they need and the supplies they need to do their business. You've heard about the lumber price issue that's continuing. The solution to that is not very immediate, and it will have a ripple effect as we go down this process. Both myself and Dustin talked about the labor supply issue. That is exacerbated by the fact that, especially in the Southern Delmarva region, we're aging. We're aging fairly rapidly. Every cloud has a silver lining. I see my friends from Tidal Health at the table over there. The demand for healthcare and wellness services as we age and live with multiple chronic conditions longer is going to continue. On the other hand, the issue of who's going to pay for that and how that payment is going to translate into the services that are being delivered is an ongoing challenge. This is something that within the Maryland experience, it's a little bit different than in Virginia and also in Delaware. For those of you who might not be aware, Maryland is somewhat unique in that there's something called global budgeted revenue that hospitals are told what they're going to make at the beginning of the year, and they have to work towards that cap, and then they can be deducted dollar amounts depending on a variety of factors. In other places, it's fee-for-service. You try to attract the patients into your campus, whereas in Maryland, you try to keep them out of your campus. Population health becomes more important. So these are the kinds of challenges. In agriculture, obviously, the shore is a single region when it comes to the commodity and the way that commodity is marketed. But there's a significant difference in terms of the pressures on farmers in Virginia versus Maryland versus Delaware. Maryland has significantly higher regulatory burdens on farmers than Delaware and Virginia do. So these are the kinds of things that are going to be some of the obstacles we will be dealing with, not only in 2021, but also going to all the way to 2024 as we look at how this thing will play out. And as Dustin said, this honeymoon with the stimulus is going to slow down and maybe come to an end. So at that point, we don't know yet whether these expenditures will serve as investments that will have a return, or whether they will have been expenditures that have come and gone and now we have to pay the bill. So that particular issue is going to continue to get us thinking, especially Dustin, who will continue to look into that. But there are also a lot of opportunities out there. Every challenge, economic challenge at the macro level, has always brought in opportunities for those entrepreneurs who can come up with different ways of doing what they're doing, better ways of doing what they're doing. This is a time for innovation, a time for thinking a little bit different, and time for dealing with competition as well as exploiting those opportunities. I was talking to a group of business leaders not too long ago on Zoom about this opportunity issue, and one of the participants asked me, you know, when are we going to know there's an opportunity? How are we going to know that we have an edge here? And it reminded me of a story I was told in engineering school, of all places, in England. I'll change it a little bit. Let's say that there's this gentleman called, I don't know, give me a name, Jonathan. Jonathan is a hardworking individual, has a decent living, good family, but his dream is to get that big windfall. He wants to win the lottery. So every night he goes on his knees, puts his hands together, looks up into the sky and says, God, let me win the lottery today. This goes on and on and on. John is now 87 years old, and he knows he's not going to last the night. He says one last time from his bed, he cannot go on his knees. He says, God, I know I'm going. I know I will not be able to enjoy it, but let me enjoy the feeling of having won the lottery once. Suddenly the sky opens up and a thundering, booming voice says, son, meet me halfway, buy a ticket, will you? So that's where we are now. We need to buy that ticket. We need to exploit those opportunities. We need to do something different if we are going to get ahead with those opportunities and if we're going to be able to mitigate those obstacles. With that, I thank you very much for having the two of us here. You have a beautiful set of panels that you'll be hearing from today. But we do have a few minutes. If you have any questions, Dustin and I will be happy to entertain them.
I have a microphone here, so raise your hand. I'll bring the mic to you. Questions for our panelists?
Memo, apparently at the speech to the joint session of Congress, President Biden is going to be talking about raising the capital gains rate to 43%, ordinary income top marginal rate to 39, corporate rate to 28. You talk about it being the right time for innovation. Isn't that exactly the wrong thing to do when we're trying to incent innovation?
Yes and no. How's that for a very definitive answer? Taxes are revenue generation modes for the public sector, the government. There's a good way of doing that. There's a bad way of doing that. The question is, will this be a good way of doing it? And will this be a good time to do it on the back of all those huge numbers you saw? I'm going to let Dustin answer that, but before he does that, I want to say this. Any public sector investment that is done right, that has a long-term return on investment, is not necessarily automatically bad just because the word tax or fee is attached to it. We collectively have to be responsible for demanding from those who represent us to make sure that these kinds of expenditures, if they are going to happen in the right kind of way. As Dustin explained to you earlier on, certain expenditures do not accomplish what they are supposed to accomplish. To me, that's money down the drain. On the other hand, certain expenditures are necessary and valuable that we have been avoiding for many years, from the local level to the state to the country, and even globally. So those are the kinds of discussions that are going to have to take place. I'm not one of those individuals who automatically sees the word tax or government revenue as automatically bad. I see it as an opportunity to do something horrible or an opportunity to do something valuable. Therein lies the problem. Unfortunately, again, our democracy is based on many built-in conflicts of interest. So you and I have some power with our voting, but we have more power with our wallets when we make donations to the causes, to the political action committees that represent us, because those individuals, those lobbyists, tend to have more say over how legislation is done, how taxes are put together. A tax bill, when it's submitted, is this thick. By the time it passes, it's this thick. And it's not you and me making it bigger. All those little carve-outs are happening out there. Every political party, every candidate says they're going to fix that. So far in my nearly 40 years of voting, I haven't seen it. So long answer to your question, It is not the best of times, but it is not necessarily the absolute worst thing that can happen if it is done right. Dustin, you can press on that button and yeah.
Do you hear me?
Keep pressing. Yeah.
Do you hear me?
Dr. Chambers, use the big mic.
Big one?
Big one, okay, turn it on.
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yep.
All right. I think I got this figured out.
No,
The light's on.
come here.
I always have bad luck with bikes. I don't know what it is. I think it's a good question. I think in general, when you're at the outset of a fragile recovery, raising taxes is an ill-advised strategy. That said, though, the U.S. is basically a very large government in terms of spending and a kind of a small to medium-sized tax strategy in terms of revenue. I think we're going to have some hard decisions to make moving forward. Do we want to raise taxes to basically support a really, really large government, or do we want to cut spending so that we can live within our means? So it's going to be a tough question moving forward. And as Memo points out, there's lots of vested interests pushing in both directions. I mean, personally, I've always been a fan of technocrats like me not playing God in D.C. and rewarding one form of income over another by having different rates of taxation on different forms of income, like earned income versus dividend income versus capital gains income. I think it would be fairer and better if we had a more unified rate of taxation and a lower one that applied more broadly.
Does that answer your question? Okay.
We have another question.
Yep.
Thank you, gentlemen, Dr. Chambers and Dr. Diriker. But Memo, what I want to ask you has to do with the opportunity for this region. I'd like to see a tighter tie between development of skilled workforce and how important it is, and investment in education, pre-K all the way through graduate degree. And could you speak to that?
Absolutely. For several of the past years, my colleagues at Beacon have done some research into the return on investment on K through 12 education as well as workforce development. And what we see is that in addition to investing in infrastructure, primarily roads and broadband, investments in education and investment in workforce development have the highest return on investment among public expenditures. So yes, indeed, the reason that's high is especially State of Maryland has a program called the EARN program, which is a workforce development program that is driven by employers. And the reason it is a good thing is because the employers are telling directly what skill sets they need, and the people being trained are being trained directly for those job openings and those requirements. One of your sponsors today is Orsted, and one of the recipients of the EARN grants, actually several of them, have to do with training people for the coming offshore wind industry. That industry might have its own issues, but it is definitely growing, especially when you look at what has happened elsewhere in the world. But it's the kind of industry that it is not easy to transfer the skills you have onshore to doing the work you're going to be doing offshore. So there's a need for a little bit of investment to get that workforce. It is a wonderful thing when you do something to get the balance, equilibrium between the skill sets needed and the skill sets available. Right now in the United States, there is a skills gap. There's a skills gap from individuals who are not pursuing college education, the career readiness cohort, as well as skills gap for individuals who are getting their bachelor's and master's and graduate degrees. So anything we do to get that equilibrium right is not only a high return on investment, but it also avoids wasting money. Some years back, there was a government grant to train auto industry manufacturing jobs because of a plant that at the time was in Maryland, has since left, but because of the way government moves, by the time the funding became available to train these individuals, the jobs had left. So that's the other part of that investment. It has to be timely, it has to be timeless, and it has to be the right size for the right demand. So I believe very much, obviously, I'm an educator, in investing in education, but it has to be driven by the employers, by the jobs, not only jobs today, but the jobs in the near future. Thank you for the question. Yes?
Another question?
A question that may be related to what you just discussed. The decrease in the labor participation rate is very concerning. We may be paying people to stay home because of whatever the incentives are. A $15 an hour minimum wage is, while lucrative to maybe some larger businesses, could put some smaller businesses out of business. I'm curious if that's a bit of a dichotomous argument or statement. That is, the decrease in labor participation rate, you're paying me to stay home, and the $15 an hour labor rate may put businesses, smaller businesses, out of business.
Yeah, this is an issue that predates the pandemic, predates all these stimulus efforts. Because of those vested interests we talked about, sometimes public policy is made in a way that is not optimal. Sometimes, quite often, public policy is made in ways that is not optimal. This is not the fault of the people making the decisions. It's the overall complex mechanism that has to take place. I'll let Dustin answer the economics piece of this, but I'll address the policy issue a little bit. Today, the fact that the minimum wage has not changed for so many years is an issue, and we collectively have failed to address this issue in a timely way so that it has become too much of a problem to bring it to where it needs to be. All our business models are now based on that low-wage worker giving us the margins we need to. If we had done this the way that many economists at the time were suggesting, incrementally, in relation to changes in the prices of the goods you generate, et cetera, maybe we wouldn't have that big gap today. And maybe this is telling us that go slow, go incremental. When you catch up, make sure you keep catching up so that it doesn't become such a step increase again. This is definitely an issue because when you look at a well-paid middle-class economy does better. But you cannot do that, as you just mentioned, at the expense of the businesses who are now suddenly faced with this big step increase. There are no easy answers, but sooner or later, the wages, the minimum wages at the lower end of the spectrum have to catch up to the realities of the economy, just not immediately like that. Dustin, what do you think?
Yeah, I think a $15 minimum wage is a terrible idea, and I think it would have a stifling impact on small business. If you have a competitive labor market, that's the key, and in most areas you do, especially for low-skilled and semi-skilled workers. Wages reflect the productivity of the workers within that community. So if you want to raise wages on the lower end of the income spectrum, you need a more educated and productive workforce. So I think that points back to education as being more of a solution and having better training programs than just trying to legislate by fiat that people on the low end of the income distribution unit earn more. It doesn't really benefit someone if there's a $15 minimum wage, but there's no job in hand to take. And studies have shown that high minimum wages have a disproportionate impact on new entrants to the labor markets. If any of you have teenage kids, it tends to make it more difficult for folks to get a foothold and get that initial experience. It's also really hard on recent immigrants and people with few skills. So it may sound compassionate, but it does someone no good to have a high minimum wage, but to have 0 hours. 15 times 0 is still 0.
So I want to pick up on two things Dustin said. One is immigration. The skill gaps we are dealing with are those that are not necessarily going to be able to be picked up by changing our education system in the short to medium term. So going back to, I forgot which year it was, but way before the last president's administration, there was an effort led by the Republicans to reform the immigration system that was based on the need for the economy for skilled jobs. It could be nurses, it could be dental hygienists, it could be physicians, whatever. But that debate is going to have to happen because of what we're seeing about the availability of the right skill sets. On the minimum wage issue, the other part of that is that, if you recall, Dustin said inflation is likely to pick up. When that happens, the demand for higher wages is going to also pick up. People are going to say, hey, I can't afford to live, so pay me more. That's when that competitive skill sets issue is going to come up, and that's when there's going to be tremendous emphasis on the right skilling individuals, upskilling. Next question.
We have another question.
Good morning. As you've mentioned here today, our regional economy across the nation in the small business community has been impacted by the pandemic. In particular, they have been forced, in many instances, to procure 1, 2, or more rounds of assistance in the form of PPP, EIDL, and not always forgivable, grant-based. So going forward, knowing of that financial extension that most of them have had to procure, where do you see nationally and here on the shore the commercial lending market in working with that business community to overcome the obstacles? Do you feel as though credit will be extended and adjusted? And part two, do you see an increased need for alternative lending sources?
To the last part of that question, yes. Let's talk a little bit about the credit markets. Most financial institutions don't make money on the money I put in their deposits. The money they make is on the credit side. So if the demand is there and there's a way to make money, yes, those institutions are going to step up to the plate. The biggest problem we face is really a two-headed problem. One, regulations. The regulations were created pre-pandemic for a reality that no longer exists. The other part of that is that there is some expectation on some policymakers' mind that we will be returning to some kind of normal, so therefore we don't need to tinker with those regulations too much. That is wrong. There's no such thing as going back to normal. There's going to be an entirely new normal. So we're going to have to build the credit marketplace of the future based on that new normal, not based on our previous experiences. Old habits die hard. You know, somebody was still saying, I won't lend to somebody unless they have 30%, et cetera. That doesn't mean anything. You know, you can, as Dustin said, 30% of nothing is still 30%. So yes, we are going to see change, but innovation happens in the lesser regulated areas before it happens in the regulated areas. So to your question about alternative lending, yeah, that's definitely coming. I think we have time for one last question, correct?
We have one more for you. Here you go.
So I thought the slides from Dr. Chambers were excellent, especially the money supply that sort of went to the roof. So my question is, can we get copies of all or some of those slides at some point?
Chamber has the slides, so they can share that with you. I thank everybody very much for allowing us to share your coffee wake-up time with us. And I will now turn it over to Bill for the next panel. Thank you, everybody.